Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Spiro, back with another coronavirus update. Now, the headlines regarding the coronavirus are increasingly inescapable at this point, as we've seen more and more cases being reported across the United States and across the world. Now, at this point, no one knows for sure just how bad it really is, as we've seen major issues with the testing, especially here in the United States, where oftentimes many people are not even being tested. This raises major red flags and concerns for many people. Now, this is a topic which I plan to cover in detail in a separate report upcoming in the future, so stay tuned for that. But for now, I'd really like just to focus on who is benefiting from this crisis, specifically who is financially benefiting from this crisis, as any detective or investigative journalist worth their salt would tell you to follow the money. Now, make sure you stick around because I saved the best for last. But one obvious place to start with is a declaration of a state of emergency. Now, so far, several states in the United States have declared a state of emergency due to the coronavirus, despite some states only having one or just a very small number, very few amount of reported cases concerning the coronavirus. And these states include Florida, California, Washington, Maryland, Utah, and New York for now. And I'm sure that I won't be surprised, basically, if other states follow suit in this. But why is this significant? Well, once a state of emergency is declared, not only does the state get special powers, which can supersede ordinances and even laws, and even suspend due process, which may jeopardize individual civil liberties, they also get access to federal funding. Big, fat paychecks are handed out. But then at this point, the state would have to play ball with the federal government's rules in order to maintain that funding. So, in other words, basically, the states become federalized in a sense once they start to receive this federal funding. And this isn't the first time we've seen this battle. We've seen this before as the federal government has tried to exercise its influence over states in other federally funded programs in the past, everything from road maintenance to the education system and, of course, the militarization of police forces. Now, another industry which is making boatloads of money, of course, is the vaccine and pharmaceutical industry. As I've previously reported, Johnson & Johnson, who did participate in Event 201, which was essentially a United Nations pandemic simulation of a coronavirus outbreak, which took place just weeks before the actual coronavirus outbreak took place, has now partnered with the federal government. That's right. Johnson & Johnson has now partnered with the federal government to develop a coronavirus vaccine. And wouldn't you know it, Johnson & Johnson's stocks are currently in the green. In fact, biotech companies are some of the very few who are making money right now on the stock market, as we've seen record losses. Now, the vaccine industry alone is a $35 billion market. And they are just raking in the profits right now, big time. Now, this industry is dominated by four major players, which are GlaxoSmithKline, Sanofi, Adventis, Merck, and Pfizer. These four major players represent 85% of the vaccine market. But many other companies are also cashing in on their work related to a potential coronavirus vaccine. For example, a Harvard professor has made $400 million from his $5 million investment in Moderna, which has seen its shares spike 22%, as Moderna's CEO has seen a gain of over $80 million. And a board member of Moderna has received a $125 million gain. Now, these gains are just for these individuals and not a company as a whole, so I can only imagine how much this company is making on this crisis right now. Another drug developer and vaccine manufacturer, Gilead, or however you pronounce it, has also been seeing a major spike in their profits, and their CEOs are also raking in millions of dollars. Now, Gilead looks to be leading the race to a vaccine, as they have enjoyed airtime because of Tony Fauci name-dropping them and also getting pretty widespread coverage in the media.
One of these, and there are several that we're considering, is called remdesivir, which is a nucleotide analog that is produced by Gilead.
Yeah, so clearly the market's been very focused on what players, what companies are going to be involved in treating coronavirus globally. And I think it basically comes down to somewhat of a race to find a vaccine that's appropriate for use in humans. And what's happening now is we're going day to day, headline to headline, to determine or assess which of these companies is going to come out with an appropriate treatment. So you mentioned Moderna earlier, Gilead, J&J, AbbVie. There are many companies on this list that are looking for a vaccine. It just doesn't seem like we as an investor base really know what is going on until these vaccines are put in humans, which is an ongoing situation.
And there's no way to handicap which company you think is farther along in the race or more behind, for example?
Joe, it seems like Gilead is probably the largest company, and they happen to be in the lead by most accounts.
But fear not, the central banks also have a solution to all of our problems, as the World Bank has prepared $12 billion in financing, and the International Monetary Fund has also offered up $50 billion in financing for nations struggling to combat the coronavirus. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly how these central banks have been conquering nations without firing a shot for decades, through a debt-based system of slavery. And if and when these nations are unable to meet these requirements of these loans, these central banks essentially take over their countries and any natural resources they may have. And this has happened before through other international monetary loan type funding through these central banks for nations who have been crippled by this type of corrupt practices. Now, and they just so happen to have pandemic bonds ready to go as well, which were, of course, a result of the Ebola crisis. And then there's the CDC. Some of you may remember shortly after Trump entered office, his administration sought to massively cut funding to the CDC by over $1 billion. This, of course, followed a major scandal where the head of the CDC had to step down basically due to conflicts of interest. Now, the revolving door between the government, the CDC, the FDA, and the drug companies has been well documented, and it just so happens that Big Pharma happens to be one of the most powerful and influential lobbies on Capitol Hill.
President Trump's proposed budget plan could threaten America's ability to fight health threats. Former CDC Director Tom Frieden outlines his concerns in a new op-ed for Time magazine. He says the agency he led for 8 years now faces unprecedented and potentially catastrophic cuts.
When it comes to keeping America healthy, prevention is often the best medicine. But hundreds of millions of dollars are being funneled away from the Centers for Disease Control's Prevention and Public Health Fund. December's tax reform law stripped $750 million from the program, moving that money to the Childhood Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, instead. And this week, President Trump signed a bill cutting $1.35 billion from the PPHF over the next 10 years. In addition, funding is not being renewed for global health initiatives, which monitor outbreaks overseas, including Ebola. So where does the CDC go from here? Yesterday, I spoke with Ashley Yeager, an associate editor with The Scientist, who's been covering the story. Tell us, what is the PPHF? What does it do?
It's a program to promote public health and also keep public and private health care costs from rising.
Okay, and what kind of programs does it support now that we might not be aware of?
Well, one of the biggest is actually immunizations, trying to create infrastructure and access to shots and vaccinations for many more people, children included, across the country.
And wouldn't you know it, we just happen to have a deadly global outbreak threatening Trump's precious little stock market and all of life as we know it. Now, just yesterday, Trump signed a $8.3 billion emergency aid package when he only asked for $2 billion, and they gave him $8 billion. So how often does the government give more, like 4 times more than what you asked for? It happened here. It's okay. So $3 of that $1 billion will go to the drug and vaccine manufacturers, of course, for their research and therapeutics in response to this coronavirus. And the rest will be doled out to preparedness efforts, and I'm sure the CDC will get a nice little cut. Because as we've seen in the past, when the CDC and the vaccine manufacturers were well funded, outbreaks like Ebola, Zika, SARS, and the others which were all hyped by the mainstream media, of course, who is heavily funded by Big Pharma through advertising, we've seen these diseases quickly come and quickly go. And I guess that's because, well, they were all well funded enough to do their jobs, huh? Well, as we've seen, the CDC specifically warn that they would not be able to effectively handle an outbreak if their funding was cut. Now we have this outbreak, and the media wants you to believe it's out of control. And wouldn't you know it, of course, the CDC and Big Pharma gets more money than they asked for this crisis. And now I'm not saying that this coronavirus is a manufactured crisis, but at the same time, I'm not saying that it is not a manufactured crisis. That is up for you to decide. But it sure has, in my view, all of the earmarks of one. Now, we've seen this pattern play out before, and this is just one example that I'd like to share with you here, and it's been documented that agencies like the FBI, for example, have been responsible for manufacturing 90+% of terror plots, only to come and bust them at the last minute and be the heroes. And this justifies the agency's existence, it justifies the agency's funding, it justifies the agency's powers, which often fall outside of the Constitution, while keeping the people in check and under big government's thumb. So could this be another case of manufactured crisis? We can't rule it out. We have to see where the evidence takes us and follow the money. Now, one more piece of information which I find very interesting that someone suggests may possibly be some type of foreknowledge, perhaps, of what we are seeing unfold regarding the coronavirus today, or at the very least would suggest that not all the information is being shared with the public. Now, this is the fact that a job posting was listed on the official CDC website for a public health advisor for the CDC's quarantine program. Now, that might not sound strange now, but this job was posted on November 15th, 2019, before anyone had ever reported any information regarding this new coronavirus outbreak. Now, what are the chances of that, as we now see quarantine centers popping up all over the United States? I guess we'll just have to chalk it up as one big coincidence, right? But what we do know is to never threaten to cut the medical mafia's funding, or you just might find yourself in the middle of an outbreak. Now, there's so much more information, but I'm afraid I'm out of time right now today. Be sure to follow me on Twitter where you'll get all of the latest updates and information that a lot of times doesn't make it into my video reports, like this doozy from Activist Post exposing how there is a provision in the U.S. Patriot Act which actually allows the U.S. government to continue its biowarfare programs outside of law, which was, of course, written by Professor Francis Boyle, the Biowarfare Act, and Professor Francis Boyle has been a guest on the show many times. So you can also follow me on BitChute, because they literally can shut down this YouTube channel at any day. They've done it before. They've taken my channels before. I'm surprised this one's still up at this point, to be honest. But you can always find my work at activistpost.com. Thanks so much for watching. Please share and stay tuned for more. There's a lot more information, other reports that I have already in the works.